Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something absolutely horrifying. A world of bloodletting, bone saws, and barbaric butchery. We're exploring 18th century medicine, where doctors were deadlier than the diseases they claimed to cure. Forget everything those pristine medical dramas taught you about healing and hospitals. The brutal truth? You'd probably die from the cure before the illness even had a chance to kill you. Before we dive into this medical nightmare, take a second to subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying this content and if you want more of these deep dives into history's darker corners. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see our global community coming together for these late-night journeys. Get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's settle in for tonight's exploration. But fair warning, you might want to keep some modern medicine nearby after hearing what we're about to discuss. Picture this. You've just been transported back to the year 1750. The good news is you're conscious. The bad news is you're lying on what passes for a hospital bed, which is essentially a wooden plank covered with a straw mattress that hasn't been changed since the previous patient died on it 3 weeks ago. Your first breath in this medical establishment hits you like a physical assault. The air is thick with a cocktail of scents that would make a modern person immediately reach for their phone to call the health department. There's the metallic tang of blood, the sour stench of infected wounds, the acrid bite of unwashed bodies, and underneath it all, the sweet, cloying smell of decay that seems to seep from the very walls. The building itself is a testament to architectural optimism and medical ignorance. Windows, if they exist at all, are small and often kept shuttered because fresh air is considered dangerous to the sick. The prevailing medical theory suggests that bad air or miasma causes disease, so the solution is to keep the bad air out. Unfortunately, this also keeps out any hope of ventilation, creating a stagnant atmosphere where germs multiply like enthusiastic party guests who refuse to leave. The floors are wooden planks, warped and stained with decades of bodily fluids that have seeped between the cracks. There's no such thing as disinfectant, so these stains are permanent residents, each one telling a story you'd rather not hear. The walls are bare stone or plaster, often damp from poor construction and lack of heating. Mould grows in artistic patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't slowly poisoning everyone in the room. Lighting comes from candles or oil lamps, casting dancing shadows that make everything look more ominous than it already is. The flickering light means that medical procedures are performed in conditions that would challenge a modern person trying to thread a needle, let alone perform surgery. But we'll get to that particular horror show later. The beds, and I use that term generously, are arranged in long rows like a medieval dormitory. Privacy is a concept that won't be invented for another century or two. You're sharing your medical experience with dozens of other patients, each one coughing, moaning, or contributing to the general atmosphere of despair in their own special way. The person next to you might have a broken leg, or they might have the plague. Nobody's really sure, and frankly, nobody's particularly concerned about cross-contamination. Between the beds, the floor is littered with straw that serves as both insulation and absorbent material for whatever fluids happen to escape from the patients. This straw is changed when it becomes so saturated that it starts to ferment, which happens roughly once a month, if you're lucky. The rest of the time, you're essentially lying above a compost pile of human misery. The ceiling is low and often features exposed beams where spiders have set up elaborate communities. These 8-legged residents are actually the most hygienic creatures in the building, which should tell you something about the state of human cleanliness. Occasionally, pieces of plaster or other debris fall from above, adding an element of surprise to your recovery process. Temperature control is achieved through the revolutionary method of hoping for the best. In winter, you freeze while wrapped in whatever blankets the hospital can provide, which are usually wool that's been recycled through so many patients that it's achieved the texture of sandpaper and the smell of a barnyard. In summer, you bake in the stagnant air while flies buzz around your head like tiny disease-carrying helicopters. The acoustics of the place ensure that every cough, scream and death rattle echoes throughout the ward. Sleep is not so much rest as it is a brief escape from consciousness, interrupted regularly by the sounds of other people's suffering. It's like trying to nap in the middle of a very depressing orchestra, where all the instruments are human misery. And this is just the general ward. If you're unlucky enough to need surgery, you'll be moved to a special room that makes the regular ward look like a luxury resort. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about the people who are supposed to be helping you recover. Meet your medical team, a collection of individuals whose qualifications range from read a book once to inherited this job from my father who also had no idea what he was doing. The hierarchy of 18th century medicine is like a pyramid scheme, except instead of selling essential oils, they're selling treatments that are more likely to kill you than cure you. At the top of this medical food chain sits the physician, a gentleman who has attended university and can therefore be trusted to make life and death decisions based on theories that are completely wrong. He's dressed in a long black coat that hasn't been washed since he graduated, and he carries himself with the confidence of someone who has never been held accountable for his mistakes. His medical knowledge is based on ancient Greek texts, astrological charts, and a firm belief that most illnesses can be cured by removing blood from your body. The physician rarely touches patients directly because that would be beneath his station. Instead, he observes from a safe distance, stroking his beard thoughtfully while making pronouncements about your humoral imbalances. He speaks in Latin to impress everyone and to hide the fact that he's essentially guessing about everything. When he does examine you, it's with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture. Below the physician in the medical hierarchy is the surgeon, who is basically a barber with delusions of grandeur. In fact, many surgeons actually are barbers because the skills required to cut hair and cut into human flesh were considered roughly equivalent. The surgeon is the one who will actually touch you, which is both good news and terrifying news, depending on how you look at it. The surgeon's tools are a collection of metal implements that look like they were designed by someone who had heard about medical instruments but had never actually seen any. His knives are sharp, which is good, but they're also dirty, which is very bad. The concept of sterilization won't be discovered for another century, so these tools are cleaned by wiping them on a cloth that's been used for the same purpose since the hospital opened. The surgeon's technique is based on speed rather than precision because anesthesia doesn't exist yet. The faster he can cut, the less time you have to scream, which is considered a win-win situation. His bedside manner consists of telling you to bite down on a piece of leather and try not to move too much while he saws through your bones. Then there are the nurses, though calling them nurses is generous. They're usually women from the local community who need work and aren't particularly squeamish about bodily fluids. Their medical training consists of being told which end of a patient is the head and being warned not to steal anything valuable from the corpses. The nurses are responsible for feeding patients, changing bandages, and disposing of various unpleasant substances that emerge from human bodies. They perform these duties with the efficiency of people who have learned not to think too hard about what they're doing. Their uniform is whatever clothes they own that they don't mind getting permanently stained. The head nurse is usually a woman who has survived working in the hospital longer than anyone thought possible, which makes her either incredibly competent or incredibly lucky. She rules the ward with an iron fist and a complete disregard for patient comfort. Her philosophy is that if you're well enough to complain, you're well enough to stop complaining. There are also various assistants and apprentices wandering around, learning the medical trade by watching and occasionally being allowed to hold instruments or clean up messes. These young men are eager to prove themselves, which makes them dangerous in the way that enthusiastic incompetence is always dangerous. The hospital chaplain is technically part of the medical team, though his job is less about healing and more about preparing people for the afterlife. He's a busy man because the hospital has a very high turnover rate, and not in a good way. His bedside manner is excellent, probably because he's the only person in the building who isn't trying to stick sharp objects into you. Communication between these various medical professionals is minimal and often counterproductive. The physician gives orders in Latin, the surgeon interprets them creatively, the nurses do whatever they think is best, and the patients suffer through the resulting confusion. It's like a game of medical telephone, except the stakes are your life and everyone is playing by different rules. The most qualified person in the entire hospital is probably the janitor, who at least understands the importance of removing dead things before they start to smell worse. He's seen more medical procedures than anyone else and has developed a healthy skepticism about the entire enterprise. If you want honest medical advice, ask the janitor. He'll tell you to leave while you still can. Now that you've met your medical team, let's discuss the treatments they'll be enthusiastically inflicting upon you. The 18th century approach to medicine can be summarized as, when in doubt, remove something from the patient. Blood, limbs, organs, dignity, everything is fair game in the quest to restore your health. The most popular treatment by far is bloodletting, which is exactly what it sounds like, and somehow even worse than you're imagining. The theory is that illness is caused by having too much blood, or the wrong kind of blood, or blood that's in the wrong mood. The solution is obvious: drain some of it out and see what happens. The physician will examine you briefly, nod sagely, and announce that you need to be bled. This diagnosis is reached regardless of your symptoms. Broken leg, bloodletting. Fever, bloodletting. Sadness, definitely bloodletting. It's the medical equivalent of turning something off and on again, except instead of fixing the problem, it usually creates several new ones. The actual bloodletting process involves either cutting a vein with a sharp knife or applying leeches to your skin. If you're lucky enough to get the knife treatment, the surgeon will make a small incision and let your blood drain into a bowl while everyone watches with scientific interest. The amount of blood removed is determined by when you start to look pale, which is the 18th century equivalent of a medical measurement. If you get the leech treatment, congratulations on experiencing one of history's most disgusting medical procedures. The leeches are kept in jars and applied to various parts of your body, where they attach themselves and begin sucking your blood with the enthusiasm of tiny vampires. The theory is that leeches are more precise than knives, which is true in the same way that being mauled by a small animal is more precise than being mauled by a large animal. The leeches themselves are reused between patients because apparently the concept of single-use medical equipment won't be invented for another century. They're stored in communal jars where they swim around in water that's changed approximately never. When your treatment is finished, the leeches are carefully removed and returned to their jar to await the next patient, carrying with them whatever diseases they may have picked up from you. Another popular treatment is purging, which involves making you vomit or have diarrhea until you're too weak to complain about being sick. This is accomplished through various herbal concoctions that taste like they were designed by someone who hated both plants and people. The logic is that illness is caused by bad substances in your body. So the solution is to violently expel everything in your digestive system and hope the bad stuff goes with it. The purging medicines are made from ingredients that sound like they were chosen by throwing darts at a list of poisonous plants. Mercury, antimony, and various plant extracts are mixed together in combinations that would make a modern pharmacist call the police. The dosage is determined by the principle of more is better, which explains why so many patients die from the treatment rather than the disease. For external ailments, there's the exciting world of poultices and plasters. These are mixtures of herbs, animal products, and random substances that are applied directly to your skin in the hope that they'll draw out the illness. Popular ingredients include cow dung, ground-up insects, and various plant materials that may or may not be poisonous. The poultices are applied hot, which means you get to experience the joy of having boiling plant matter pressed against your wounds. The theory is that heat opens your pores and allows the medicine to penetrate deeper, which is technically true, but not in any way that's helpful. The poultices are left in place for hours or days, during which time they ferment and develop their own ecosystem of bacteria. Surgery is reserved for the most serious cases, partly because it's incredibly dangerous and partly because it's incredibly expensive. The surgical procedures available in the 1700s are limited to things that can be accomplished quickly with sharp objects and a lot of hope. Amputations are popular because they're straightforward. You cut off the diseased part and hope the patient doesn't die from shock or infection. The surgical process begins with restraining the patient because anesthesia won't be invented for another century. You're held down by several strong men while the surgeon works as quickly as possible. The faster the surgery, the less time you have to die from pain, which is considered a medical breakthrough. The surgical instruments are cleaned by wiping them on a cloth, which is the 18th century equivalent of sterilization. The same instruments are used on multiple patients throughout the day, spreading infections with the efficiency of a medieval plague. The surgeon's hands are also cleaned by wiping them on the same cloth, because the connection between dirty hands and infection won't be discovered for another century. Pain management consists of giving you a piece of leather to bite down on and telling you to be brave. Some hospitals provide alcohol before surgery, which helps with the pain, but makes the patient more likely to move at inappropriate moments. The most advanced pain management technique is knocking the patient unconscious with a blow to the head, which works but comes with its own set of complications. Recovery from surgery involves lying in the same bed where the surgery was performed, surrounded by the blood and other fluids that couldn't be cleaned up properly. The surgical site is bandaged with cloth that's been used for the same purpose on previous patients, because the concept of sterile bandages is still a century away. The success rate of these treatments is measured not by how many patients recover, but by how many patients survive long enough to leave the hospital. This is a low bar, but it's the only bar they have, and they're proud of clearing it occasionally. Let's talk about cleanliness in the 18th century hospital, or rather, let's talk about the complete absence of anything resembling cleanliness. The modern concept of hygiene is still about a century away from being discovered, so everything in the hospital operates on the principle that dirt is natural and therefore harmless. The hospital's approach to sanitation can be summarized as, if you can't see the germs, they probably don't exist. This philosophy leads to some interesting decisions about how to maintain a medical facility. For example, the floors are cleaned by sweeping the larger pieces of debris into corners and hoping the smaller pieces will eventually decompose on their own. Water for cleaning comes from the same sources used for drinking, which means it's already contaminated before it enters the building. The water is stored in large barrels that are cleaned approximately never, allowing various microorganisms to establish thriving communities. When this water is used for cleaning, it essentially spreads germs around rather than removing them. But since nobody understands germ theory yet, this is considered an improvement. The hospital laundry system is a marvel of inefficiency and cross-contamination. Bed linens, bandages, and clothing are all washed together in large vats of hot water without soap, because soap is expensive and its benefits are not well understood. The washing process consists of boiling everything together until it's technically clean, then hanging it to dry in the same room where patients are coughing and bleeding. The same water is used for multiple loads of laundry, so by the end of the day, you're essentially washing clean items in a soup of other people's bodily fluids. The laundry is considered clean when it no longer smells actively offensive, which is a very low standard but the only one available. Bandages are particularly problematic because they're expensive and therefore reused extensively. After being removed from one patient, they're washed in the communal laundry system and then applied to the next patient who needs them. This creates an efficient system for spreading infections between patients, though nobody realizes this is happening. The hospital's waste disposal system is based on the revolutionary principle of putting unpleasant things somewhere else and hoping they go away. Human waste is collected in chamber pots that are emptied into a pit behind the building, creating a permanent source of contamination that seeps into the groundwater and attracts every disease-carrying insect in the area. Medical waste, including amputated limbs and removed organs, is disposed of by throwing it into the same pit or feeding it to the hospital's pigs. Yes, the hospital keeps pigs, both as a food source and as a waste disposal system. These pigs are then occasionally served to patients as part of their recovery diet, completing a circle of contamination that would impress modern epidemiologists with its efficiency. The hospital's approach to pest control is to accept that rats, mice, and insects are permanent residents and try to coexist peacefully with them. The rats are actually considered beneficial because they eat some of the food scraps and smaller pieces of medical waste. The fact that they also spread disease is not yet understood, so they're allowed to roam freely throughout the hospital. Personal hygiene among the medical staff is optional and rarely exercised. The physicians wash their hands when they remember to, which is infrequently, and the surgeons clean their instruments by wiping them on whatever cloth is handy. The concept that dirty hands and instruments can spread disease won't be discovered for another century, so everyone operates under the assumption that cleanliness is purely aesthetic. The hospital's ventilation system consists of hoping that bad air will somehow replace itself with good air through the process of wishful thinking. Windows are kept closed to prevent the entry of miasma, which is believed to cause disease, so the air inside becomes increasingly stagnant and contaminated. The result is an atmosphere that would challenge a modern person's ability to breathe, let alone recover from illness. Bathing facilities for patients are non-existent because bathing is considered dangerous for sick people. The theory is that water opens the pores and allows disease to enter the body, so patients are kept as dry as possible throughout their stay. This means that people who are already sick are also dirty, sweaty, and increasingly malodorous as their treatment progresses. The hospital's dining facilities operate on the same principles as the rest of the institution, which is to say they operate without any principles at all. Food is prepared in kitchens that are cleaned sporadically by staff who don't wash their hands, using water that's already contaminated. The food is served on plates that are cleaned by wiping them with a cloth, and utensils are shared between patients without any cleaning between uses. The result of all this is a hospital environment that's more dangerous than the outside world, where patients are more likely to acquire new diseases than to recover from their original ailments. but since nobody understands the connection between cleanliness and health, this is considered normal and acceptable. The high mortality rate is attributed to the severity of the diseases being treated, not to the conditions in which the treatment is taking place. In this environment, your immune system is not just fighting your original illness, but also battling a constant stream of new infections introduced by the hospital itself. It's like trying to recover from a cold while being repeatedly exposed to every other disease known to humanity. The fact that anyone survives this experience is a testament to the resilience of the human body, not to the quality of the medical care being provided. Now let's discuss the culinary experience awaiting you in this 18th century medical establishment. If you thought airplane food was bad, prepare to develop a new appreciation for modern institutional cuisine. The hospital's approach to nutrition can be summarized as, if it doesn't kill you immediately, it's probably medicine. The hospital kitchen is a room that would make a modern health inspector weep openly. It's located in the basement or a separate building, far enough from the patient wards that the screams of the cooks can't be heard over the screams of the patients. The kitchen staff consists of people who were hired based on their ability to lift heavy pots rather than their understanding of food safety or nutrition. The cooking facilities are primitive, even by 18th century standards. There's a large fireplace with iron pots hanging over it, and that's essentially the entire kitchen. Temperature control is achieved by moving pots closer to or farther from the fire, which means that food is either burned or undercooked, with no middle ground. The concept of even heating won't be invented until someone figures out how to make ovens that don't require a degree in engineering to operate. The hospital's food budget is determined by the principle that sick people don't need good food because they're too ill to appreciate it anyway. This leads to a menu that consists primarily of whatever ingredients are cheapest and most readily available, regardless of their nutritional value or edibility. The staple of the hospital diet is gruel, which is essentially water with some grain products stirred into it until it achieves the consistency of wallpaper paste. The gruel is made in large batches that are intended to last for several days, which means that by the time you get your portion, it's been sitting around long enough to develop its own personality. The gruel recipe is flexible in the way that desperation is flexible. If oats are available, it's oat gruel. If barley is cheaper, it's barley gruel. If the hospital is particularly short on funds, it's gruel made from whatever grain-like substances can be found, including sawdust, ground-up acorns, and other creative ingredients that technically qualify as food. The prevailing medical theory is that pain serves a useful purpose in recovery, alerting both patient and physician to the progress of treatment. This means that eliminating pain would actually interfere with the healing process. So the goal is not to prevent suffering, but to help patients suffer more efficiently. When you arrive at the hospital with whatever ailment has brought you there, you can expect that ailment to be accompanied by significant additional pain from the treatments you'll receive. This is considered normal and even beneficial because pain that results from medical intervention is believed to be more therapeutic than pain that results from disease. The hospital's pain management toolkit consists of 3 basic options: alcohol, opium, and prayer. Alcohol is the most readily available, usually in the form of brandy or rum that's been watered down to reduce costs. The theory is that alcohol dulls the senses and makes patients more compliant during procedures, which is true, but comes with the side effect of making patients more likely to vomit during surgery. The alcohol is administered in doses that are determined by guesswork and availability, rather than by any scientific understanding of how alcohol affects the human body. Too little, and the patient remains fully aware of what's happening to them. Too much, and the patient becomes unconscious or dies, which solves the pain problem but creates other complications. Opium is available for the most severe cases, but it's expensive and its effects are not well understood. The opium is usually administered as laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, creating a combination that's both addictive and unpredictable. The dosage is determined by the same scientific method used for alcohol, which is to say it's determined by hoping for the best. The opium provides genuine pain relief, but it also causes constipation, respiratory depression, and addiction, none of which are recognized as medical problems yet. Patients who receive opium often become dependent on it. But since addiction isn't understood as a medical condition, these patients are simply considered to have developed a preference for the medicine. Prayer is the most commonly prescribed pain management technique because it's free and doesn't require any medical knowledge to administer. Patients are encouraged to pray for strength to endure their suffering, and the hospital chaplain is always available to provide spiritual guidance on how to suffer more effectively. The prayer approach to pain management is based on the theory that pain is a test of faith, and that enduring it properly will result in spiritual benefits that outweigh the physical discomfort. This theory is particularly popular with medical staff, who don't have to experience the pain themselves, but get to feel good about providing spiritual support. For surgical procedures, the pain management strategy is speed rather than anesthesia. The faster the surgeon can work, the less time the patient has to experience pain, which is considered a medical breakthrough. Surgeons take pride in their ability to amputate a limb in under 2 minutes. Not because it improves the medical outcome, but because it reduces the duration of screaming. Patients undergoing surgery are physically restrained to prevent them from moving during the procedure, which is necessary, but adds the psychological trauma of being held down against their will to the physical trauma of being cut open while conscious. The restraints are usually leather straps or ropes, applied by hospital staff who have learned to ignore the pleading and struggling of their patients. The most advanced pain management technique available is the use of pressure points and nerve compression to temporarily reduce sensation in specific areas of the body. This technique is known to a few skilled practitioners, but it's not widely understood or consistently effective. When it works, it provides temporary relief. When it doesn't work, it adds additional pain to the procedure. Some hospitals experiment with herbal remedies for pain relief, using plants like willow bark, which actually contains compounds similar to modern aspirin. However, the dosages are inconsistent, the preparation methods are unreliable, and the effects are unpredictable. Patients might receive too little to be effective, or too much and experience toxic side effects. The psychological approach to pain management involves convincing patients that their suffering is noble and meaningful. Patients are told that enduring pain builds character, demonstrates faith, and contributes to their eventual recovery. This approach costs nothing and makes the medical staff feel better about inflicting pain, even if it doesn't actually help the patients. For chronic pain, the hospital's approach is to assume that patients will eventually get used to it or die, whichever comes first. There's no concept of long-term pain management or quality of life considerations. Patients who continue to complain about pain after their initial treatment are considered difficult or ungrateful. They've seen so much suffering that they've become desensitized to it, and they view patient complaints as interruptions to their work rather than as medical symptoms that need to be addressed. Children receive the same pain management as adults, which is to say they receive essentially no pain management at all. The theory is that children are more resilient than adults and will recover more quickly from painful procedures. This theory is not based on any medical evidence, but it's convenient for the medical staff who don't want to deal with crying children. Women's pain is often dismissed as hysteria or emotional weakness. and they're expected to endure medical procedures without complaint as part of their natural role as sufferers. This attitude means that women often receive even less pain relief than men, because their pain is considered less legitimate or important. The overall result of this approach to pain management is that patients often suffer more from their treatment than from their original illness. The hospital becomes a place where pain is not just tolerated, but actively inflicted, creating an environment where recovery is achieved despite the medical care rather than because of it. Welcome to the most efficient disease distribution centre in the 18th century, the hospital ward. If you came in with one illness, congratulations. You're about to collect several more like they're trading cards. The hospital's approach to infection control can be summarised as, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Except in this case, it usually does kill you. The concept of germs and bacteria won't be discovered for another century, so the hospital operates under the assumption that diseases are caused by bad air, moral failings, or astrological misalignments. This leads to some interesting decisions about how to prevent the spread of illness, most of which involve doing exactly the opposite of what would actually be helpful. The hospital's patient population is a diverse collection of people suffering from every disease known to humanity, all housed together in the same rooms with no understanding of how diseases spread from person to person. It's like a medical convention where all the attendees are the diseases themselves, and they're all very excited to meet each other. Tuberculosis is one of the most popular diseases in the hospital, partly because it's common in the general population, and partly because the hospital environment is perfectly designed to help it spread. Tuberculosis patients cough constantly, spraying infected droplets into the air that other patients breathe. Since ventilation is poor and windows are kept closed, these droplets linger in the air like tiny biological weapons. The hospital's response to tuberculosis is to house these patients with everyone else, because the connection between coughing patients and disease transmission hasn't been discovered yet. The constant coughing is considered a symptom to be treated rather than a method of spreading disease, so no effort is made to isolate these patients or protect others from their respiratory emissions. Smallpox is another frequent visitor to the hospital, bringing with it the characteristic pustules and fever that make patients particularly unpleasant to be around. Smallpox patients are sometimes isolated, not because anyone understands that the disease is contagious, but because the pustules are considered aesthetically offensive and might disturb other patients. The isolation of smallpox patients is inconsistent and ineffective because the hospital staff don't understand how the disease spreads. They might isolate patients with visible pustules while allowing patients in the early stages of the disease to mingle freely with others, creating a perfect system for spreading smallpox throughout the hospital population. Typhus is particularly well suited to hospital life because it's spread by lice, and the hospital environment is essentially a lice paradise. The combination of unwashed bodies, shared bedding, and poor sanitation creates ideal conditions for lice to thrive and spread from patient to patient. The hospital's approach to lice control is to accept them as a natural part of life and hope they don't cause too much trouble. The typhus patients develop high fevers and delirium, which makes them difficult to care for, but also makes them more likely to wander around the hospital and interact with other patients. This helps ensure that the typhus spreads efficiently throughout the patient population, creating a self-sustaining cycle of infection. Dysentery is another hospital favourite, causing severe diarrhoea and dehydration that makes patients particularly miserable. The hospital's waste disposal system ensures that dysentery spreads quickly through the patient population because the same facilities are used by everyone and cleaning between uses is minimal. The dysentery patients are often too weak to make it to the waste disposal facilities, so they soil their bedding and clothing, which is then washed in the communal laundry system and redistributed to other patients. This creates an efficient system for spreading intestinal diseases throughout the hospital, ensuring that everyone gets to experience the joy of severe digestive distress. Syphilis patients are treated with mercury, which causes its own set of symptoms, including tooth loss, tremors, and mental deterioration. The mercury treatment is often more dangerous than the syphilis itself, but since the connection between mercury and these symptoms isn't understood, the treatment is considered successful if the patient survives long enough to leave the hospital. The hospital's approach to wound infections is to assume that pus and inflammation are natural parts of the healing process. Infected wounds are cleaned with contaminated water and dressed with dirty bandages, ensuring that the infections persist and spread to other parts of the body. The concept that infections can be prevented or treated is still decades away from being discovered. Gangrene is treated by amputation, which is often successful in removing the infected tissue, but creates new opportunities for infection at the amputation site. The surgical instruments and techniques used for amputation ensure that new infections are introduced during the procedure, creating a cycle where treating one infection leads to another. The hospital's patient mortality rate is impressive, with many patients dying not from their original illness, but from diseases they acquired during their stay. This is considered normal and acceptable because the connection between hospital conditions and patient outcomes isn't understood. The high mortality rate is attributed to the severity of the diseases being treated rather than to the treatment environment. Cross-contamination between patients is facilitated by every aspect of hospital operations. The same medical instruments are used on multiple patients without cleaning. The same bandages are reused, the same water is used for multiple purposes, and the same staff members move between patients without washing their hands or changing their clothes. The hospital's approach to epidemic diseases is to treat them as individual cases rather than as outbreaks that need to be contained. When multiple patients develop the same symptoms, it's considered a coincidence rather than evidence of disease transmission. This leads to situations where entire hospital wards become infected with the same disease, but no one recognizes it as an outbreak. The result of all this is that the hospital serves as a disease amplification center, taking individual cases of illness and turning them into community-wide epidemics. Patients who survive their hospital stay often leave with more diseases than they arrived with, and they carry these diseases back to their communities, where the cycle begins again. The irony is that the hospital staff genuinely believe they're helping people, and they work hard to provide the best care they know how to give. They just don't know very much, and what they do know is often wrong. The road to medical hell is paved with good intentions and a complete lack of understanding about how diseases actually work. If you're a woman in the 18th century and you find yourself in need of medical care, particularly for anything related to childbirth or reproductive health, you're about to discover that the hospital's approach to women's medicine makes their general medical practices look sophisticated by comparison. The prevailing medical theory about women is that they are essentially defective men, prone to hysteria and governed by their reproductive organs in ways that make them fundamentally unreliable as patients. This theory influences every aspect of women's medical care, from diagnosis to treatment to the basic assumption that women's complaints are probably exaggerated or imaginary. Childbirth in the hospital is an experience that combines all the worst aspects of 18th century medicine into one terrifying package. The process begins when a woman in labour arrives at the hospital, usually because something has gone wrong with her delivery at home. This means that hospital births are already complicated cases, handled by people who don't understand the normal birth process, let alone the complications. The hospital's birthing facilities consist of a room with a bed, if you're lucky, or a straw mattress on the floor if you're not. There's no privacy, no comfort measures, and no understanding of the importance of cleanliness during delivery. The room is often shared with other labouring women, creating a communal birthing experience that nobody wants. The medical staff's understanding of childbirth is based on theories that are not just wrong, but actively harmful. They believe that labour pain is punishment for original sin and that women should endure it without complaint as part of their natural role. Pain relief during childbirth is considered inappropriate because it interferes with the natural process and might make women too comfortable with the idea of having children. The hospital's approach to assisting with delivery involves a lot of pulling, pushing, and the use of instruments that look like they were designed by someone who had heard about childbirth but had never actually seen it happen. Forceps are used liberally, often causing more damage than they prevent, because the concept of gentle assistance hasn't been invented yet. The birthing position mandated by the hospital is lying flat on the back, which is the worst possible position for delivery, but the most convenient for the medical staff. This position works against gravity and makes delivery more difficult and dangerous, but it allows the physician to maintain his dignity while attending to the birth, which is considered more important than the mother's comfort or safety. The hospital's understanding of the female reproductive system is based on ancient Greek texts and creative speculation rather than actual observation or study. They believe that the uterus can wander around the body, causing various symptoms, and that women's emotional states are directly controlled by their reproductive organs. This leads to treatments that are both ineffective and often harmful. Postpartum care consists of keeping new mothers in bed for extended periods, often weeks, because movement is considered dangerous after childbirth. This prolonged bed rest leads to blood clots, muscle weakness, and depression, but these complications are attributed to the natural weakness of women rather than to the treatment itself. The hospital's approach to breastfeeding is to discourage it in favour of wet nurses or artificial feeding, because breast milk is considered inferior to other options. Wet nurses are often women who have recently given birth themselves and may be malnourished or ill, but this is not considered a problem because the connection between maternal health and milk quality isn't understood. Infant mortality in the hospital is staggeringly high, with many babies dying within days or weeks of birth from infections, malnutrition, or complications from the delivery process. This is considered normal and natural because the concept that infant deaths might be preventable hasn't been developed yet. The hospital's treatment of gynecological problems is based on the theory that most women's health issues are caused by hysteria, which is believed to originate in the uterus. The treatment for hysteria involves a variety of approaches, including bloodletting, purging, and the application of strong-smelling substances to the nose to shock the wandering uterus back into place. Women who seek medical care for pain or other symptoms are often dismissed as being overly emotional or attention-seeking. Their symptoms are attributed to their natural feminine weakness rather than to actual medical conditions, which means that serious problems often go undiagnosed and untreated until they become life-threatening. The hospital's approach to contraception and family planning is to pretend that these concepts don't exist. Women are expected to have as many children as possible, regardless of their health or circumstances, and any attempt to prevent pregnancy is considered immoral and potentially dangerous. Miscarriages and stillbirths are handled with the same lack of understanding and compassion that characterises the rest of women's medical care. These events are attributed to moral failings or divine punishment rather than to medical causes, and women who experience pregnancy loss are often blamed for their own misfortune. The hospital's treatment of sexually transmitted diseases in women is particularly harsh because these diseases are considered evidence of moral corruption rather than medical conditions. Women with syphilis or other sexually transmitted infections are often refused treatment or subjected to particularly painful and ineffective treatments as punishment for their perceived moral failings. Mental health issues in women are automatically attributed to reproductive causes, regardless of the actual symptoms or circumstances. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions are all diagnosed as hysteria and treated with the same ineffective and often harmful methods. The hospital staff's attitude toward women patients is a mixture of condescension and suspicion. Women are considered unreliable witnesses to their own symptoms, prone to exaggeration and deception, and fundamentally less important than male patients. This attitude affects every aspect of their medical care, from the attention they receive to the quality of treatment they're given. The result of all this is that women face additional dangers and discrimination when seeking medical care, on top of all the general hazards of 18th century medicine. They're more likely to be misdiagnosed, undertreated, or blamed for their own illnesses, and they face unique risks related to reproductive health that are poorly understood and inadequately addressed. The irony is that women often serve as caregivers and healers in their communities, with practical knowledge about health and medicine that exceeds that of the trained physicians. But this knowledge is dismissed as superstition or folk wisdom, while the physician's theoretical knowledge, however wrong, is considered authoritative and scientific. If you're unfortunate enough to be experiencing mental health issues in the 18th century, the hospital's approach to treatment will make you question whether insanity is really the problem or if it's actually the most rational response to the world around you. The hospital's understanding of mental illness is based on theories that are so wrong they're almost artistic in their creativity. The prevailing medical theory is that mental illness is caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This means that the treatment for any mental health condition involves adjusting these humours through bloodletting, purging, and the administration of various substances that are guaranteed to make you feel worse than you did before you sought help. The hospital's diagnostic process for mental illness is remarkably simple. If you're behaving in a way that the staff considers inappropriate, you're mentally ill. If you're sad, you're melancholic. If you're angry, you're choleric. If you're happy at the wrong time, you're manic. If you're quiet, you're withdrawn. There's no behaviour that can't be pathologized by creative interpretation. The treatment facilities for mental health patients are located in the basement or in a separate building, far enough from the regular hospital that the screaming doesn't disturb the other patients. These facilities are essentially dungeons, with stone walls, minimal lighting, and no heating. The theory is that harsh conditions will shock patients back to sanity, which is about as effective as it sounds. The rooms for mental health patients are small, windowless cells with straw on the floor and iron rings in the walls for restraints. Privacy is non-existent, and patients are often housed together regardless of their specific conditions or the severity of their symptoms. It's like a prison, except the guards think they're providing medical treatment. Restraints are used liberally and creatively. Patients are chained to walls, strapped to beds, or locked in wooden boxes that prevent movement. The theory is that physical restraint will lead to mental restraint, helping patients regain control over their thoughts and behaviors. The fact that this approach usually makes patients more agitated is considered evidence that they need more restraint, not less. The hospital's approach to treating depression involves bloodletting to remove the excess black bile that's believed to cause melancholy. Patients are bled until they're weak and anemic, which does indeed change their mental state, though not in the way that was intended. The weakness caused by blood loss is interpreted as a calming effect, so the treatment is considered successful. Manic patients are treated with purging and cold water treatments designed to shock them into a calmer state. They're given powerful laxatives that cause severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, then doused with cold water or forced to take cold baths. The physical shock of these treatments sometimes does calm patients down, mainly because they're too weak to be agitated anymore. The hospital's understanding of what we would now call anxiety disorders is that they're caused by an overactive imagination and too much thinking. The treatment involves keeping patients in sensory deprivation conditions, with minimal stimulation and no access to books, conversation, or anything that might encourage thought. This approach usually makes anxiety worse, but the increased agitation is interpreted as evidence that the treatment is working. Patients with what we would now recognize as schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders are treated with a combination of physical restraints and attempts to shock them back to reality. This might involve sudden loud noises, bright lights, or physical pain designed to break through their delusions. The fact that these treatments often make symptoms worse is attributed to the severity of the illness rather than to the ineffectiveness of the treatment. The hospital staff's approach to interacting with mental health patients is based on the assumption that these patients are fundamentally different from normal people and therefore don't deserve the same consideration or respect. Patients are spoken to like children or animals, and their complaints or requests are dismissed as symptoms of their illness rather than as legitimate concerns. The daily routine for mental health patients consists of sitting in their cells with minimal human contact, poor food, and no activities or stimulation. The theory is that boredom and isolation will help patients focus on getting better, but the reality is that these conditions often make mental health symptoms worse and create new problems like depression and anxiety in patients who didn't have them before. Family visits are discouraged because interaction with loved ones is believed to reinforce patients' delusions or inappropriate behaviors. Patients are often isolated from their families for months or years, which destroys their support systems and makes recovery more difficult. The hospital staff consider this isolation therapeutic because it removes patients from the influences that supposedly caused their illness. The hospital's approach to discharge planning is to keep patients until they either die or learn to hide their symptoms well enough to convince the staff that they're cured. There's no concept of ongoing treatment or support, so patients are either completely cured or completely hopeless. Most patients learn to suppress their symptoms rather than actually recovering, which means they're released back into the community without having received any real help. The treatment of children with mental health issues is particularly disturbing because children are considered to be naturally closer to madness than adults, and therefore more dangerous. Child patients are subjected to the same harsh treatments as adults, but with even less consideration for their developmental needs or emotional well-being. The hospital's understanding of the causes of mental illness includes moral failings, divine punishment, and exposure to inappropriate ideas or experiences. This means that treatment often includes moral instruction, religious counseling, and attempts to identify and eliminate the corrupting influences that supposedly caused the illness. The staff working with mental health patients are usually the least qualified people in the hospital because working with the mentally ill is considered unpleasant and unrewarding. These staff members often have no training in dealing with mental health issues and rely on physical force and intimidation to manage patients who are already frightened and confused. The overall result of the hospital's approach to mental health treatment is that patients often leave in worse condition than when they arrived, if they leave at all. The treatments are traumatic, the conditions are inhumane, and the underlying philosophy is based on punishment rather than healing. It's a system designed to warehouse people with mental illness rather than to help them recover. The tragic irony is that many of the behaviours that lead to hospitalisation for mental illness are actually rational responses to trauma, poverty, or other difficult life circumstances. But instead of addressing these underlying causes, the hospital focuses on suppressing the symptoms through force and intimidation, creating a cycle of trauma that makes recovery nearly impossible. Welcome to the 18th century hospital's most consistent feature: a rigid social hierarchy that determines not just the quality of care you receive, but whether you receive any care at all. If you thought modern healthcare had inequality issues, prepare to be amazed by a system where your social status literally determines whether you live or die. The hospital operates on a strict caste system that would make ancient India proud. At the top are the wealthy patients who can afford private rooms and personal physicians. Below them are the middle-class patients who can pay for basic care. At the bottom are the poor, who are treated as medical experiments and sources of free labour rather than as actual patients deserving of care. The hospital's charity system is designed more to make wealthy donors feel good about themselves than to actually help poor patients. Wealthy patrons donate money to the hospital in exchange for having their names associated with charitable works, but they have little interest in ensuring that their donations actually improve patient care. The medical staff's attitudes toward patients are heavily influenced by social class. Wealthy patients are treated with deference and respect, their symptoms are taken seriously, and their comfort is a priority. Poor patients are treated as burdens and nuisances. Their symptoms are questioned and their discomfort is considered irrelevant. The hospital's record keeping reflects these class differences, with detailed records kept for wealthy patients and minimal documentation for poor patients. This means that wealthy patients' medical histories are preserved and can be used to improve their future care, while poor patients' experiences are forgotten as soon as they leave or die. The discharge process also varies by social class. Wealthy patients are released when they feel ready to leave, with detailed instructions for continued care and follow-up appointments. Poor patients are discharged when the hospital needs their bed for someone else, regardless of their condition, and they receive no follow-up care or support. The overall effect of this social hierarchy is to create a medical system that reinforces existing inequalities rather than addressing health as a universal human need. The hospital serves as a microcosm of society, where your social status determines not just your quality of life, but your chances of survival. Let's discuss the one area where 18th century hospitals truly excel, helping patients transition from life to death with remarkable efficiency. If you're looking for a place to die in the most unpleasant way possible, surrounded by strangers who are too busy to notice your passing, the hospital is definitely your best option. The hospital's approach to death is refreshingly honest. They expect it to happen frequently and have developed systems to handle it with minimal disruption to their daily operations. Death is not seen as a medical failure, but as a natural outcome that's often preferable to continued suffering, which is a surprisingly practical attitude for an institution that's otherwise completely impractical. The process of dying in the hospital begins long before your actual death, usually around the time you realize that the treatments are making you sicker than your original illness. This realization dawns slowly as you notice that each medical intervention leaves you weaker, more painful, and less hopeful about your prospects for recovery. The hospital staff's attitude toward dying patients is a mixture of resignation and relief. They've seen so much death that they've become desensitized to it, and they often view a patient's death as the end of a difficult case rather than as a human tragedy. This emotional distance helps them cope with their work environment, but it doesn't provide much comfort to patients who are facing their final days. The physical process of dying in the hospital is made more unpleasant by the conditions in which it takes place. You're surrounded by other sick and dying people, creating an atmosphere of despair that makes it difficult to find peace or acceptance. The constant noise of coughing, moaning, and medical procedures ensures that your final hours are anything but restful. Privacy during the dying process is non-existent. You're dying in full view of other patients, medical staff, and visitors, all of whom have their own concerns and pay little attention to your personal struggle with mortality. Your death becomes a public event, witnessed by strangers who will forget about you as soon as your body is removed from the ward. The hospital's approach to pain management during the dying process is the same as their approach to pain management in general, which is to say there isn't one. Dying patients are expected to endure their final suffering with dignity and minimal complaint because pain relief might interfere with the natural process of death or make the patient too comfortable. Family visits during the dying process are discouraged because they're considered disruptive to hospital operations and potentially harmful to other patients. Families are often notified of a patient's death after the fact, rather than being given the opportunity to be present during their loved one's final moments. This policy ensures that most people die alone, surrounded by strangers who view their death as a routine occurrence. The hospital's understanding of the dying process is based on religious rather than medical principles. Death is seen as a spiritual transition rather than a biological event, which means that the focus is on preparing the patient's soul for the afterlife, rather than on providing comfort or managing symptoms during the dying process. The hospital chaplain plays a more important role in end-of-life care than the medical staff, because his job is to ensure that patients die in a state of grace rather than in a state of comfort. The chaplain's bedside manner is usually better than that of the medical staff, partly because he's not trying to cure anyone, and partly because he's genuinely concerned with the patient's welfare, albeit in a spiritual rather than physical sense. The actual moment of death is often missed by the medical staff, who are too busy with other patients to monitor dying patients closely. Deaths are usually discovered during routine checks, rather than being witnessed and recorded as they happen. This means that the exact time and circumstances of death are often unknown, which creates problems for record keeping and family notification. The hospital's procedure for handling dead bodies is efficient, but not particularly respectful. Bodies are removed from the wards as quickly as possible to prevent them from disturbing other patients and to make the bed available for the next patient. The removal process is handled by hospital staff who treat dead bodies as objects to be disposed of, rather than as the remains of people who deserve dignity. The hospital morgue is located in the basement, where bodies are stored until they can be claimed by families or disposed of by the hospital. The morgue is not refrigerated because refrigeration hasn't been invented yet, so bodies decompose quickly and create additional health hazards for the hospital staff and remaining patients. Bodies that are not claimed by families are disposed of in mass graves or sold to medical schools for dissection. The hospital doesn't make much effort to locate families or ensure that bodies are properly identified before disposal, which means that many people disappear without their families ever knowing what happened to them. The hospital's record-keeping for deaths is minimal and often inaccurate. Deaths are recorded when someone remembers to do it, and the cause of death is usually listed as whatever the patient was originally admitted for, regardless of what actually killed them. This means that the hospital's mortality statistics are essentially meaningless. But since no one is keeping track anyway, this doesn't matter. The psychological impact of constant death on the hospital staff is significant but unacknowledged. The staff develop coping mechanisms that include emotional detachment, dark humour, and alcohol consumption, all of which help them function in an environment where death is a daily occurrence, but don't address the underlying trauma of working in such conditions. The hospital's approach to grieving families is to get them off the premises as quickly as possible. Families are given minimal information about their loved one's death and are discouraged from asking questions or expressing their grief in ways that might disturb other patients or staff members. The overall effect of the hospital's approach to death and dying is to make the end of life as unpleasant and undignified as possible. Patients die in pain, alone, and surrounded by strangers who view their death as a routine inconvenience. It's a system that treats death as a failure to be hidden rather than as a natural process that deserves respect and compassion. The irony is that in a time when death is common and expected, the hospital manages to make it even more traumatic and meaningless than it would be in other settings. By medicalizing death without understanding it, the hospital strips away the cultural and spiritual frameworks that traditionally help people cope with mortality, leaving patients and families to face death without support or comfort. So there you have it, a complete tour through the nightmare that was medical care in the 1700s. If you've made it this far without developing a newfound appreciation for modern medicine, you might want to check your pulse, because you've just witnessed a comprehensive catalogue of everything that can go wrong when good intentions meet complete ignorance. The 18th century hospital was essentially a perfect storm of medical incompetence, where every aspect of patient care was designed to make sick people sicker. From the moment you walked through the doors, you were entering an environment that was more dangerous than the streets outside, staffed by people who meant well but knew nothing, and operated according to principles that were not just wrong, but actively harmful. The truly remarkable thing about these hospitals is not that so many people died in them, but that anyone survived at all. The human body's ability to recover from illness, despite receiving the worst possible medical care, is a testament to the resilience of our species and the power of the immune system to overcome both disease and medical intervention. Every aspect of the hospital experience we've explored tonight, from the filthy conditions to the barbaric treatments, was considered state-of-the-art medical care by the standards of the time. The physicians, surgeons, and nurses genuinely believed they were providing the best possible treatment using the most advanced medical knowledge available. They weren't evil or incompetent by the standards of their era. They were simply working with information that was completely wrong. This raises some uncomfortable questions about our own medical practices. How much of what we consider advanced medical care today will be viewed as barbaric ignorance by future generations? What treatments that we're confident about now will be seen as harmful mistakes in 100 years? The history of medicine is largely a history of confident people being confidently wrong about almost everything. The social inequalities we observed in the 18th century hospital are particularly disturbing because they're not entirely historical. While modern medicine has made tremendous advances in understanding disease and developing effective treatments, the connection between social class and health outcomes remains strong. The wealthy still receive better medical care than the poor, and access to healthcare is still determined more by ability to pay than by medical need. The hospital's approach to mental health treatment is perhaps the most shocking aspect of 18th century medicine. But it's worth remembering that the systematic mistreatment of people with mental illness continued well into the 20th century. The transition from viewing mental illness as moral failing to understanding it as a medical condition is relatively recent, and the stigma associated with mental health issues persists today. The gender discrimination we saw in 18th century medical care also has modern echoes. Women's pain is still more likely to be dismissed or minimized by medical professionals, and women's health issues are still understudied and undertreated compared to men's. The assumption that women are unreliable witnesses to their own symptoms hasn't disappeared, it's just become more subtle. The complete absence of infection control in 18th century hospitals seems almost unbelievable until you remember that the connection between cleanliness and health wasn't established until the mid-19th centuries. The idea that invisible organisms could cause disease was so revolutionary that it took decades for the medical establishment to accept it, even when presented with overwhelming evidence. This resistance to new ideas is another constant in medical history. Every major advance in medical understanding has been met with skepticism and resistance from the established medical community. The physicians who rejected hand-washing, anesthesia, and germ theory weren't stupid. They were human beings who found it difficult to accept that their fundamental beliefs about medicine were wrong. The pain and suffering we've described tonight wasn't the result of cruelty or indifference, but of ignorance combined with the confidence that comes from not knowing what you don't know. The medical professionals of the 1700s were doing their best with the tools and knowledge available to them, just as we are today. Perhaps the most important lesson from this journey through medical history is humility. The physicians of the 18th century were just as confident in their treatments as modern doctors are in theirs, and they were just as wrong about most things. This doesn't mean we should distrust modern medicine, but it does suggest that we should approach medical knowledge with appropriate skepticism, and remember that our understanding of health and disease is still evolving. The next time you visit a modern hospital, take a moment to appreciate the clean sheets, the pain medication, the understanding of infection control, and the basic respect for patient dignity that we now take for granted. These advances didn't happen overnight. They're the result of centuries of trial and error, scientific discovery, and gradual progress toward a more humane approach to medical care. And if you ever find yourself complaining about waiting times, hospital food, or uncomfortable procedures, remember that you're experiencing medical care that would seem miraculous to someone from the 1700s. You're receiving treatment based on scientific understanding rather than ancient theories, in an environment designed to promote healing rather than spread disease, from professionals who understand the importance of cleanliness, pain management, and patient dignity. The story of medical progress is ultimately a story of human resilience and ingenuity. Despite centuries of harmful treatments and misguided theories, people kept seeking medical care and medical professionals kept trying to help them. The gradual accumulation of knowledge and the slow development of more effective treatments represent one of humanity's greatest achievements. So as we close this exploration of medical history's darker chapters, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come and to remember that progress is possible, even when it seems impossible. The patients who suffered through 18th century medical care contributed to our modern understanding of health and disease, even if they didn't live to see the benefits of their sacrifice. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the medical nightmare that was the 1700s hospital. I hope it's given you a new appreciation for modern medicine and a healthy respect for the progress that's possible when ignorance is gradually replaced by knowledge. Sweet dreams, and remember to be grateful for your clean sheets, effective pain medication, and the knowledge that your doctor actually understands how diseases spread. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember that no matter how bad your day has been, at least you didn't have to experience 18th century medical care. That's something we can all be thankful for. Before we truly close this chapter on medical history, it's worth reflecting on the human cost of the progress we've discussed. Every advance in medical knowledge came at the expense of countless patients who suffered through ineffective and harmful treatments. The development of modern medicine is built on a foundation of human suffering that's difficult to comprehend from our current perspective. The physicians and surgeons of the 1700s weren't monsters. They were people trying to help others with the limited knowledge and tools available to them. Their confidence in treatments that we now know were harmful wasn't malicious, but was based on the best understanding of their time. This reminds us that medical knowledge is always provisional, and that humility should be a cornerstone of medical practice. The patients who endured these treatments were often desperate people who had nowhere else to turn. They submitted to bloodletting, purging, and primitive surgery not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they hoped for relief from conditions that were making their lives unbearable. Their willingness to undergo these treatments, despite their obvious risks, speaks to the fundamental human desire to survive and recover. The social inequalities we observed in 18th century hospitals remind us that healthcare has always been influenced by factors beyond medical need. The quality of care you received depended on your ability to pay, your social status, and your gender. While we've made progress in addressing these inequalities, they haven't disappeared entirely, and the struggle for equitable healthcare continues today. The environmental conditions in these hospitals, from the lack of sanitation to the absence of infection control, created perfect breeding grounds for disease. The irony is that institutions designed to heal people often made them sicker, a reminder that good intentions without proper knowledge can be more dangerous than no intervention at all. Perhaps most importantly, this exploration of medical history reminds us to appreciate the scientific method and evidence-based medicine. The transition from treatments based on ancient theories and superstition to treatments based on scientific research and clinical trials represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. The fact that we now test medical treatments before implementing them, rather than simply assuming they work, has saved countless lives. As we continue to advance medical knowledge and develop new treatments, we should remember the lessons of history and approach new discoveries with both excitement and caution. The confidence of 18th century physicians in their harmful treatments should serve as a warning against overconfidence in our own medical practices. The story of medical progress is ultimately a story of hope. Despite centuries of setbacks, harmful treatments, and misguided theories, humanity has gradually developed a better understanding of health and disease. The patients who suffered through 18th century medical care contributed to this progress, even if they didn't live to see its benefits. Their suffering was not in vain if we learn from it and continue to work toward better, safer, and more effective medical care for all people, regardless of their social status, gender, or ability to pay. The best way to honour their memory is to continue the work of improving medical care while remembering the importance of humility, compassion, and respect for human dignity in all medical practice.